We've already talked a little bit about the conscription crisis in World War I, and now we're going to talk about the conscription crisis as it shows up in World War II. And there are a lot of things about this that would probably never happen today, but we will talk about them anyway. So in 1940, Mackenzie King is elected Prime Minister, and he's elected Prime Minister on a promise of refusing to conscript soldiers in this war. So he runs on a promise that he would not institute a draft to sort of fight this war. And by 1942, the world has sort of changed its opinion largely about how bad Nazis are and whether this is a war that needs to be won. And also the casualties of the Second World War are getting higher, and so they're running out of troops to be able to sort of fight this war. So in 1942, this is one of the first things that would likely never happen today. In 1942, Mackenzie King holds a referendum, and this is a referendum about whether or not he should be released from his campaign promise not to conscript. So he's asking the entire population about, hey, by the way, the situation we were in 1940 is different from the situation we're in now. Is it okay if I break my election promise and we start talking about a draft? Okay, as I said, that would likely never happen today, but that's not really what we're talking about. And the results of this referendum are either entirely irrelevant or incredibly important, depending on the perspective you take on them. So on the one hand, these results are entirely irrelevant because King never institutes a draft anyway, right? He doesn't draft anyone. He doesn't conscript anyone. No one gets draft notices. So in that perspective, these results mean absolutely nothing. This referendum is absolutely not at all important. But on the other hand, this referendum is incredibly important because of what it tells you about the way that the sort of population in Canada is divided in 1942, and how not only the referendum itself, but also sort of the fact that anyone even asked is perceived in sort of different parts of the country. So at a results level, broadly speaking, the results are really positive. As I said, the understanding of Nazis as sort of a global challenge is shifting, so this does not become a European war. There's an understanding that this is a global war. There's sort of some shifting understandings that happened between 1940 and 1942 around what's happening in this war. So across the country, 80% of Canadians are saying, yeah, that's fine. You can be released from your election promise. We can talk about a draft. So on the surface, King has been granted sort of leave to institute a draft if that's what he feels he needs to do. The important part that we need to sort of dig into a little bit is that vote total hides a very particular experience. So 80% of the country says, yeah, it's fine if you conscript people. 73% of Quebec says, no, that's not okay. Okay? So first of all, you have, again, a really deep division about the idea of compulsory military service between Quebec and the rest of Canada. But at the same time, in a lot of ways, even though there's no draft in World War II, that second conscription crisis makes Quebec even more upset. Because from their perspective, okay, since the rest of the country didn't care about the draft the last time around, King's promise about I'm going to be prime minister and I'm going to be prime minister and I'm not going to conscript people was a promise made to Quebec. And from their perspective, if that's a promise you made to Quebec, then the people you need to ask about whether or not it's okay to break that promise is Quebec, not the whole country. And from certain quarters within Quebec, that movement, that decision to ask the whole country, is really perceived as King attempting to weasel out of a promise, because the population distribution is such that if you ask the whole country, and Quebec is the only province that has a problem with this, you're going to get results that say it's fine, because Quebec's votes even though 73% of the population is voting in exactly the same way in Quebec, get drowned out by everyone else across the country. So Quebec is kind of pissed off that the rest of the country even got to vote on this, because from their perspective, it's not a promise that was made to the rest of the country, because the rest of the country wasn't concerned about that. And it also sort of builds the emerging ideas about trust and distrust in the federal government, about whether or not the federal government is going to actually do what it says it's going to do to protect the interests of Quebec. We can sort of see, and you can definitely see it sort of now, when we start looking at sort of whether or not Quebec trusts the federal government to be acting in its interests. And there's a lot of ways that you could say that Quebec doesn't think that the federal government is acting in its interest, right? Quebec runs its own pension plan. Quebec runs their own sort of tax collection. They run their own immigration policy. There's a lot of things that are cared for by the federal government in a lot of other provinces in Canada that Quebec has essentially said, we don't trust you to do this in a way that works for us, so we're going to do it ourselves. And that experience is really, really important. It is in some ways connected to experiences like the second conscription crises. And it's one of those things that I often see students who sort of go, yeah, there's this one conscription crisis in World War I, and they forget about the second one in World War II. Because in World War II, there is no conscription, there's no draft. So they sort of go, yeah, the only one that matters is the one where we're sending people to war out of necessity. But if you are in Quebec and if you understand that sort of second experience of conscription, not around conscription specifically, but as a statement about, I can't trust any promise that comes from the federal government at all. I can't trust that they're going to be bound by their own rules. I can't trust that they're going to do any of these things. Then that second conscription crisis gets viewed very, very differently. Okay? We're going to talk a little bit in the rest of this unit, not so much about Confederation, but more about all the things that you need to understand in sort of Franco-Anglo relationships in Quebec's history in order to be able to make sense of the 1982 sort of constitutional changes and then the referendums after that, because there's a lot of stuff that is important and it doesn't make sense unless you've got those bits.